US imperialism is a very big topic. We're going to focus today on the economic side, and I'm going to focus on the monetary side. And the goal of this brief presentation is twofold. One is to give you a sense of how the system works, what do we mean by U.S. monetary hegemony, and two, what we can do about it right now. So there's a very important issue of um, uh, there's a major debt crisis unfolding in many countries in the global south right now, and because of the role of the United States and the role of the U.S. dollar globally, Americans and the American government play an outsized role in these debates. So I want you to understand what you can do right now to express solidarity with people in the global south and around the world, and how this relates to U.S. monetary hegemony. So just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, the dollar is king. So when we talk about U.S. Monetary hegemony, what we mean is a few different things where you see this power manifested. The first is the dollar is the world's reserve currency. So the world's savings are held in dollars. And that gives the United States what a French finance minister once called the exorbitant privilege, where basically we print the world's money. And we can talk more about what that means. Uh, Secondly, the Federal Reserve is unofficially the world's global central bank because the dollar is the world's currency, and the Federal Reserve has the ability to print dollars. It basically makes the United States the world's central bank and gives us a tremendous amount of power over the global economy. One of the clear manifestations of this power that you see play out politically is the ability to deny countries access to the global financial dollar-based system, which we can impose sanctions to both punish, and in many cases, simply the threat of imposing sanctions is enough to intimidate the US's official enemies. And then the last kind of key plank of this is the ability, which only the United States has, to veto anything at the IMF, right? So the Europeans together could do this, but the United States government alone has the power to stop any action at the IMF. Where does this come from? So just a brief history lesson. The seeds of the current global monetary system were planted at Bretton Woods, a hotel in New Hampshire. At this conference, the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, who was at that point a Treasury official for the UK government, helped set up what we now know as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Keynes initially wanted the IMF to be a true global central bank that issued a global currency that was controlled by the specific institution and not by any single government. However, the power balance after World War II meant that the UK, which had previously held the world's kind of monetary hegemony, with the pound sterling as the world's reserve currency and the Bank of England as the world's de facto central bank, was very much weakened compared to the US, which at that point was the only country to emerge from World War II stronger. So the US delegation preferred basically to turn the Federal Reserve into the world's central bank and the dollar into the world's global reserve currency. Fast forward 30 years later, there was a lot of international monetary turbulence in the late 60s. People kind of went back to the idea of creating a global currency, partly inspired, so they created what we now know as special drawing rights, which is partly inspired by the Bancor, with some key differences. One, it is not its own currency. It is a basket. It is based on a basket of currencies. Originally, the dollar, a bunch of European currencies, the pound, and the yen, but now the dollar, euro, pound, yen, and then recently the renminbi. It is not a real currency because it's only allowed to be used by central banks. You cannot walk into a supermarket and buy vegetables or milk with SDRs. Now, the issue of SDRs was sort of dormant for many decades until the global financial crisis of 2009. And after that crisis, the world's major central banks, the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, all began doing what's called quantitative easing, which the easiest way to understand that is they printed a ton of money and gave it to their banks. Governments in the global south cannot do this without risking the depreciation of their currency, setting off an inflation spiral. And we can talk about why that is. It's mainly due to the fact that they can't produce all the things that they need with their local domestic currency only. They would need to import a lot of things. In 2009, the G20, the group of the world's 20 most powerful nations, agreed to create 183 billion SDRs, about US $250 billion, to help governments deal with the global financial crisis. Because of the formula used for these SDRs, it's based on the size of countries' economies, and given the large inequality between rich and poor countries, it means that countries in the global north, rich countries, received about 70% of those 183 billion SDRs. To give you a sense, all of Africa received about 15 billion SDR, and all of South America about 16 billion. Nevertheless, that was money they could use to pay for necessary imports, to pay off their foreign debts. As we all know, anyone who's lived in the global south, the question of how to get hard currency, dollars, euros, and yen is a huge one for policymakers and regular people in all of these places. Now, fast forward to the pandemic and why I'm talking to you about this today. The pandemic lowered export earnings for many countries around the world as the global economy ground to a halt. It also increased the debt burden on the global south because they had less money to pay back their debts. This meant diverting scarce resources to debt service instead of dealing with the major public health emergency at hand. Larry Summers, the former head of the Treasury, proposed $650 billion in SDR creation. That number is based on the amount that the IMF can create without seeking congressional approval from the US government. UNCTAD, the UN group that advocates for countries in the global south, proposed $3 trillion in SDRs, creating just $3 trillion out of thin air. And then having rich countries agree to give these SDRs to the poor, since most rich countries, again, can print their own currencies and buy what they need in those, and therefore do not need these SDRs as much as poor countries do. Andrés Arauz, who recently lost the presidential elections in Ecuador and who's an economist, argued for $4 trillion, saying that instead of getting bogged down in fights over how to deal with the unfair allocation formula, there's no limit to how much money can be created. So he says just create enough money so that countries in the global south can get what they need, right? And we can figure out the formula later. This attempt to help countries in the global south deal with the impending global debt crisis was stopped by the previous administration led by Donald Trump. They opposed SDR creation because they didn't want to loosen the financial stranglehold created by sanctions on enemies of the United States, like the governments of Venezuela and Iran. Again, the US government controls access to the global dollar-based financial system and can impose severe sanctions, creating a form of economic siege warfare. Biden, while he was running for president, did promise that the US would quickly agree to a $650 billion SDR creation. That has yet to happen, so we need to keep putting pressure on the US administration to do this. There's things that we can do right now. So all of these, there's two. I'm listing here two major demands and putting them in order of kind of things we can do in the short term, and then things that would take a longer term struggle. So the first thing is we got to print the damn money. Just put the same way that the U.S. government has been handing out trillions to corporations, to households. There's been checks arriving in the mail. There's been huge bailouts. The Federal Reserve has created, $3 trillion of new money. We need to make sure that Congress does this for countries in the global south. So we could push Congress to approve as many trillions in SDRs as we want. The second thing is, we do need to change the formula, which requires pushing Congress and the IMF to change this formula. Or we also could ask the Federal Reserve to establish emergency swap lines with poor countries. So the IMF is willing to lend dollars to other major central banks when there is a major financial crisis. They did this in 2009. They did it again last year, but they won't extend the same courtesy to poor countries, right? So they will only do it for the countries where their economic hardship would hurt the U.S., right? And if poor countries don't have the ability to kind of boomerang and hurt the American economy, then we've simply kind of let them fail, which is obviously deeply unfair and unjust. The second thing is to cancel the debt, right? So we need to understand why these countries even need money to begin with. And that's because they're in serious debt in dollars and euros. So we should push the G20 governments to write off the debt, not merely suspend debt payments as they've been doing the last year and change. We need to also push private banks and hedge funds, private bondholders, to write off their debt, to simply take a haircut on these bonds. And then eventually we need to fight for an international sovereign bankruptcy procedure that allows governments to simply say we cannot pay and deal with all of their creditors at once in a fair and transparent and timely process, and not dealing with vulture funds and other kind of predatory financial institutions. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.